Hello, church. It's Pastor Alex back with another evening reflection. One of the questions I get asked from time to time is if I have a favorite scripture, and I have a lot that I go back to over and over again, but there's one that's been the most important informational in my ministry. I asked for it to be preached at my ordination, and it's the story in Luke 7, verses 11 through 17, the story of the widow of Nain. And there's one particular moment in the story that I'd come back to just time and again, and I thought I'd share it with you tonight. There's a lot going on in the congregation, and I know that there's a lot of grief that's floating around for a wide variety of reasons, due to the quarantine, due to some of the health issues that have been going on, and even some of our folks from our church who've died and met their reward. And in times of grief, this is a story I turn to. Just thought I'd summarize it briefly. It's a story of Jesus and his disciples are going into a town called Nain. And as Jesus is leading this crowd of people who are behind him, the disciples and those who are hopeful and eager to learn and are excited to see what he has next to teach, they meet this other crowd that's coming out from the city. And it's a funeral procession. And they're carrying the body of a young man, and his mother's there, and she's a widow as well, which means that she would be destitute and not have anyone to depend upon. And these two crowds of hope and despair meet right outside the dusty gates of the city of Nain. And Jesus sees this widow, and there's this one moment where it says that he felt compassion for her. And if you look at the original Greek, it's splognosta is the one of the Greek roots of it, and its original meaning is that it has to do with kind of like when we're gut wrenched, like your bowels are like just completely upset, or your heart's in your throat, or any of those kind of like visceral images that we use to try to describe when we have a lot of emotion. And what Jesus does with that kind of visceral reactions different than what we would do. Of course, he goes up to the mother, he tells her not to weep, and then he tells the young man in the coffin basically to get up and to arise. And the young man does, and he gives him to his mother, and the word travels throughout the whole countryside. And it's a story I go back to again and again in ministry, not just when I'm preparing for funerals, but also as I'm aware of there being grief in my life and also in the lives of the folks in our congregation. To remind myself that there are times and places when it feels like we spend a lot of time grieving, a lot of time with unjust things happening, and the things that aren't fair and that we can't control happening just all around us. And what do you do with an emotion like that if you're part of that grieving crowd, or maybe you feel like the widow yourself today, that your entire life has been altered and you don't know quite what to do with it? If that's the case, then hopefully the rest of us might be having a better day, and we can be like the crowd of people who are following Jesus and bring a little bit of hope back to the situation where you find yourself. Again, the drama unfolds with one crowd coming in, following Jesus with hope, and one feeling the despair of the widow, and it's how they meet in the middle. And it's when hope and despair meet that Jesus works resurrection. And you think Good Friday, of course, and Easter Sunday, and how all too often it seems like we forget in the midst of our troubles and our pains that God is sending resurrection and peace and hope and all of the other things that are all the sweeter and more resolved because of the difficulties that we've been through. It doesn't mean that there's always a reason for the difficulties that we're going through, but that there is a release and a peace and a truth. And I have to remember that in the midst of some of the painful stuff that we go through. So if you are having a great day, then I'm glad to hear it. And you can be one of the folks following Jesus. And this is the important point. When we confront the difficult pain and despair of the world, we are not Jesus ourselves. We are just part of the crowd that points the way to him. And he's the one who lifts up an entire new way of being. But if you feel like you are that widow tonight, where you're really struggling with something, or you're holding on to some kind of bitterness or frustration or fear, if you're part of that crowd, then read the story. It's in Luke 7, and remember that it foreshadows another only Son who is resurrected as well, Jesus himself. And ultimately, we trust and believe that that's how not just Jesus' story, but ours is completed in his death and resurrection. And as we prepare for some funerals from afar, probably in our congregation, and some memorials that will take place down the road after the quarantine is over, I'd invite us to keep those who are grieving in our prayers, but also to remember and point the way toward the hopefulness that comes as Christians in the good news of Jesus Christ. So I hope you have a good evening, and God bless. And as always, we will continue our normal programming tomorrow, 10 a.m. We'll be talking about some church history and kind of the different churches in town, sort of what some of the differences are. And on Thursday, we'll pick up looking at the book of Jonah at the noon. So be aware it'll be at the noon hour. So hope you have a good night, and I will talk to you guys soon.